Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Julia Janae. Thank you for being with us. We are in day 30 of the Sean Diddy Combs trial out in New York, and a lot has been happening, to say the least. We want to check in now with Court TV's legal correspondent, Kelly Craft, who is outside of the New York federal courthouse right now. And Kelly, a lot has happened today. It seems that the case against Sean Combs is changing ahead of closing arguments.
A lot going on. Good afternoon to you, Julia. So behind me, the federal courthouse, things were supposed to get started here at 12 Eastern time. So that was going to be the charge conference. The jury is not here today, so they had the day off. They will be back tomorrow for closing arguments. But we started hearing early this morning that things were getting pushed back, as well as the prosecutors were streamlining their case against Sean Diddy Combs. So we're going to hear more once court gets underway at 2 p.m. Eastern. So the charge conference was moved from beginning at 12 Eastern to 2 p.m. Eastern. So we'll get more details as to the charges and how that charge conference will go. But important because the judge had told the federal prosecutors that he really wants them to streamline their case. So the prosecutors wrote a letter to the judge saying that they have now streamlined their case. And what are they doing? They are pulling back on some of those charges. The attempted kidnapping. This is in relation to Capricorn Clark, who said that she was kidnapped by Sean Combs and his buddies to go over to Kid Cudi's home. And then she was forced to wait in the car. This was her testimony while they went inside Kid Cudi's home. And then eventually, what the prosecutors had said led to the attempted arson of Kid Cudi's Porsche. So attempted kidnapping and then attempted arson. Those are two of the charges that they are pulling back on, because what we're hearing is they're saying there's no information that they can actually now tie, that they can't maybe prove, tie Sean Combs to that attempted arson of Kid Cudi's Porsche. Now, Kid Cudi came to the stand, Julia, and he testified, and he basically said it was no doubt in his mind that he had something to do with it. But defense counsel, on cross-examination, clearly pointed out there were no fingerprints, there was no indication that Sean Combs was tied to that torching of his Porsche. So again, attempted kidnapping, attempted arson, also aiding and abetting in regard to sex trafficking. So again, prosecutors are framing this as we've needed to streamline our case. The judge has asked us to do so. That's what we're doing here. Now, some on the streets are just saying, well, they just didn't have enough to prove those charges. So again, we're going to hear more at that charge conference, Julia.
It's a fair question, Kelly, because this is coming after they brought those witnesses into the courthouse. Kid Cudi's only purpose, and correct me if I'm wrong, was to testify about this arson. So you have this celebrity witness come in, and to now, on the eve of closing arguments, to say, oh, we're no longer going forward with it because we're streamlining things for the jury, it just doesn't quite make sense. But tell us about what's coming up, because I understand the judge at one point had not yet ruled on the motion for a judgment of acquittal that happened yesterday, and normally judges answer that pretty quickly.
Julia, so sometimes in regard to appeals, they do reserve their judgment. It doesn't happen all the time, as you know, as you just mentioned. Usually we hear a ruling from the judge denying those motions all the time, because most of the time those are denied right away. Here, I think just because this case is so huge, so many charges, and now with this new development of prosecutors streamlining their case, he probably thought, well, you know what, I had told prosecutors to streamline the case. Let's see what they end up doing. And now we have a different situation, a different case, if you will, today. So he reserved judgment on that. But yesterday, we really got a glimpse into what the closing arguments are going to be from defense counsel. They went line by line, each one of those charges, saying that prosecutors did not put forth enough evidence to prove any of the charges. So that's exactly what they said during yesterday's motion for judgment of acquittal. But again, so 2 o'clock today, we're going to hear more, Julia. Tomorrow, the closing arguments. And, you know, Sean Diddy Combs, he said yesterday that was an interesting exchange that he had with the judge, that he was not going to testify, because during that exchange, he even told the judge, he said, you're doing an excellent job, Your Honor, which we never really hear defendants say something like that to the judge. And then when the back and forth was taking place, Sean Diddy Combs, he placed his hands on top of the defense counsel tables and leaned forward when he was asked about testifying and if he thoroughly discussed it with his defense counsel. He then leaned forward and said, and looked at his defense counsel and said, "Yes, Your Honor, I thoroughly discussed this with my lawyer." So interesting to watch that exchange between him and the judge yesterday, Julia.
Oh, yeah, so much happened yesterday, and it seems more is happening today. Kelly, I know you're going to keep us updated on what the judge decides on that motion and when we can expect those closing arguments. We'll let you go for now and bring in National Trial Attorney Krista Ramey to get her reaction to what the prosecution is doing. Do you think the jury is going to hold it against the federal government for backing off on these charges, or are they going to not even notice?
Probably won't notice. Really. It happens all the time. You know, I just had a charge conference a couple days ago. You go through the evidence as it came in at trial, and sometimes you're making concessions. Sometimes you're, fighting to keep things in. But the reality is as an attorney prosecuting a case like this, so high profile, you do not want one single claim to remain in that you cannot prove. First of all, prosecutors are supposed to do justice. They're not just supposed to win. But if you did not make those elements of that crime, for arson, for instance, here, that was a very weak, theory for the arson. I think that, Kid Cudi did not hold up well on cross. We all could agree on that. It really, you can't make it, then why do you keep it in? Because of your ego? And jurors, I think if they do remember it and say, well, where does that Kid Cudi thing fit into all of this? They don't really hold it against anyone because they probably are thinking, well, they probably didn't really make the case on this, so they didn't put it in here.
Can the defense
I think
point the
that's
finger?
forgiving.
Do you think the defense can point the finger at the prosecution and say, they told you at the beginning of this there was this arson, and now you're not going to see it on your verdict form or in the jury instructions? Is that allowed, or will everyone sort of ignore it?
I think that everyone will sort of ignore it. There's things that you can point out that are part of a opening statement that the defendant didn't prove, but this is a legal question, really. Ultimately, it comes down to is the judge deciding whether or not there was sufficient evidence to put to the jury for that claim, for that arson claim. So on a legal question, one that's not determined by the jury, then the judge, you can't argue where's the arson, part of this, because the judge has ultimately signed off on that and probably would have dismissed it on his own had the parties not agreed to it.
And we will see what the judge does with this motion for judgment of acquittal that's still pending. I still think that is strange, but I get what Kelly said. This is a big case, so likely the judge just taking it under advisement. But sometimes we do see things getting thrown out by a judge. Even if it's not the entire case, it'll be pieces or charges in a case. What do you think the likelihood is that we will see other parts of this sex trafficking transportation case thrown out? We only have about 30 seconds.
I don't think none. I don't think you're going to see any more thrown out. I think that what is getting thrown out is, I think the judge is just out of an abundance of caution. Sometimes judges don't like to pull the trigger fast on high-profile cases. I think that's what you have here.